Hello and welcome to another edition of Civil War Reflections with Brian Steele Wills. And this is your host. I just thought we would talk today a little bit about Memorial Day. I know that many of you have gone out to commemorate Memorial Day on a variety of scales or levels. Either you've gone to events or you watched things on television. But we're going to talk a little bit about the Civil War side of that, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the individuals involved and some of the philosophies behind what comes to be known as Memorial Day today, but at the time was frequently referred to as Decoration Day. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War between the states, Decoration Day was the name that held for a period of time. Of course, a way to remember the fallen from across the land. So north or south, there were Union people that remembered the fallen in that respect, and people that had relatives in the Confederate service that did the same thing. So as we go into another time of reflection on what this war meant, we can think about it in terms of what's something that everyone thinks of in a more general way. Of course, we all watched Saving Private Ryan and different films that have been Pork Chop Hill. I just saw that replayed on television. And any of those that would reflect the sacrifices that people made in the Second World War, or Korea, Vietnam. But as I mentioned, we'll think about the late unpleasantness. One of the first significant victories for the Union in 1862 actually did not come at Fort Donelson, where Ulysses Grant got his nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. That's certainly a story worth telling, and all of the people associated with that, some positively and some negatively. But the first major victory in the war in 1862 would have been in Mill Springs or Logan's Crossroads, where George Henry Thomas, the Virginian who stayed with the Union, will fight against Felix Zollicoffer and his commander, who's, of course, one of the Crittendens. So the Battle of Mill Springs was a Union victory because the Federals were finally able to drive the Confederates back from the vicinity of Logan's Crossroads back to their big camp on the rain-swollen Cumberland River. And in one of the turning point events, really was probably not as significant as it seemed later on. I guess the main event that really broke it was a bayonet attack that finally pushed the Confederates back. But in the meantime, they had lost their leader, Felix Zollicoffer. Felix Zollicoffer, aside from having one of the great names in the Civil War, was a fire eater. He was a strong-minded and aggressive figure, wanted to take the war to the Federals as much as possible. And so he's leading the forces in the field that come up from Beech Grove to take on George Thomas at that crossroads. The point was to try to hit Thomas before he could be reinforced or combine his men with a general by the name of Albin Sheff. Albin Sheff had come down. He was just beginning to get to the area when Zollicoffer attacked. It was misty kind of rain. There had been heavier periods of rain as typically happened, but whenever these weather systems roll through, but it was still very misty, rainy in the morning when they made the attack. And one of the problems for the Confederates was that as they made their attack, they had no way to really push too much beyond. There was a sort of a high piece of ground that they wanted to capture, which they were actually able to push the Federals off of. But just beyond that, the Federals had more troops and artillery, which the Confederates didn't have the way to counter. So they have some success, but to evaluate things, as so often was the case, the Confederate leader, in this case General Zollicoffer, will come up to try to see things for himself, but inadvertently he rides into the Union lines by accident, and he is going to be seeing troops that are getting ready to fire into the Confederate lines, and he orders them to stop, that they're firing into their friends to halt their fire. Well, he has the character of a leader, of a general, and so the men hold back their fire. And part of it was that he was wearing a raincoat that would fully covered his main uniform, so they just saw this very commanding figure on top of a horse shouting orders without any particular sign of insignia one way or the other, Union or Confederate, so they assumed that he was one of theirs. Unfortunately, he had an aide, actually had another one who came up too, but an aide who said quite loudly, "General, those are the enemy." You would think maybe he would be smart enough to whisper in his ear and say, "We need to get the heck out of here," but he didn't. And then there was a shot fired that struck the horse of the commander that was immediately opposite Felix Zollicoffer and his aide and the other man. And the person whose horse was struck was a man named Speed Fry. Speed Fry was from Lexington, and they love their horses in Lexington, and I'm sure he was not pleased to have his horse shot out from under him, and so he fired back and ordered his men to fire, and among other things, Felix Zollicoffer gets struck and killed, and the aide and the other man as well. So it's a loss of leadership for the Confederates. That's not necessarily what broke the situation, but it is what certainly made it more difficult for the Confederates to prevail. In the end, there was a tree near where Zollicoffer's body rests in the road and then brought over. And that tree comes to be known as the Zolly tree. And the Zolly tree will be then decorated with garlands of flowers later on, and that's one of the early commemorations of the fallen, in this case for Felix Zollicoffer, where he had been shot and killed at this Battle of Mill Springs. Another battle that, again, just has that symmetry that you think of in warfare as being unlikely, and yet is probably more common than not, is the Battle of Shiloh or Pittsburgh Landing, where you have all of this fighting in the springtime in April amidst all these petals is the terrible carnage of the hornet's nest and the bloody pond and all of the rest. Well, again, the veterans who survive and then are able to continue to survive through the rest of their service will be remembering the fallen at places like Shiloh. We'll remember the fallen that had taken place on both sides, not just the Confederate side, but the Union side as well. Another person who helped to sort of raise the level of awareness over the years was a man named Sam Watkins, who came back and wrote a very colorful, a lot of historians can have different questions about different points, but he certainly was what he wrote was accessible to the general public. They could read it and be engaged by it. I've actually have used through the years Sam Watkins' Company H, Aytch, Company H. I like the pronunciation H, but Company H is the memoir, and he talks about a lot of service and a lot of the places that he fought or the experiences he had. And of course, I taught at Kennesaw State University, and of course, just down the mountain, down from the road from the mountain, Kennesaw Mountain. And he talks about at Cheatham Hill, where he helped to defend that position against the attacking federal forces, and talks about the angel of death and the dead angle at Kennesaw Mountain. Of course, so many of the dead are then reinterred in the Marietta National Cemetery or reinterred in Confederate cemeteries, other places. Again, people trying to think about the sacrifices people made in the war would think about fighting in the East or fighting in the Western Theater, fighting in the Trans-Mississippi, and so forth. Those sacrifices, so many of these folks were determined should be remembered, that you remember those people who fell on the bloodied fields of places like that. Another book that I wrote that I was very proud of was Inglorious Passages, Non-Combat Mortality in the Civil War, and those non-combat deaths counted too. They mattered too. If you think about the vacant chair around the table, it didn't matter why that chair was empty. It was there vacant regardless of the circumstances. So, it's easy for us to judge from a distance what happens when someone does something foolish or injudicious, whatever term you want to use, when they do something that costs them their lives. Those lives are lost. And in the Civil War, sometimes, of course, disease killed far more people than bullets did, but sometimes accidents will contribute, or even having psychological issues like people who simply cannot handle their circumstances and commit suicide, or people who just are unlucky. Maybe you go down to take a bath in the river and don't come back because you get out too far, or you get into a awkward, bad situation. You get on a train, the train wrecks, you're on top of the boxcar, and you sleep on top of the boxcar because the boxcar itself is too filled with people to rest. And then, of course, you can either roll off, or if you're on top of it and a low bridge comes along, you could be swept off in that way. Some people died trying to get on trains or off of trains. Boiler explosions, of course, on steamboats as well as steam engines. And, any kind of incident like that still could cost the lives of people who went off to serve their country or protect their homes and never come back. Again, regardless of circumstances, one of the people that I remember, one of the sadder circumstances, a young man who'd been in war for a couple of years goes off to come home on, I'm sure, furlough, and is in the cavalry, so he's riding his horse. He comes to a river that's swollen from the rain and decides that he can jump in the river and cross with his horse. He's probably done it as a young man for recreation 100 times, and yet this time the river is too much, and he is swept away to his death. And so here's a man simply wants to come home, as they would say, to see the old folks, and he's not going to make it. It often throws into mind a place that I visited in North Carolina. Of course, you could visit too. The Zebulon Vance home that's right there at the outskirts of Asheville, North Carolina. And you can go there and see his home restored. And on the wall was an image that depicted the cycle of life with the soldier as a metaphor. So as a young man, you start to watch him growing up, and as he develops from a baby into a young adult, he's got a rifle, musket, and then he's going to be older and proud at the highlight of his life, and then of course in decline, and finally at the end of his life, no longer the soldier that he had once been. So that always to me a very sobering reminder again of the cycle of life. Well, wartime can interrupt that cycle and cost the lives of men who will be at the prime of their life or certainly close to it, and yet war snatches them away as well. It also reminds me of one of Theodore Roosevelt's favorite poets, Edward Arlington Robinson. I always liked Theodore Roosevelt, so I looked up and read all of Edward Arlington Robinson's poems, and they're definitely a darker type of poem. They have usually a very tough kind of message, and one of the poems is a poem called Mr. Flood's Party, and Mr. Flood's Party features a gentleman by the name of Eben, E-B-E-N, Eben Flood, so Ebb and Flood, which I think is a interesting takeoff on that cycle of life idea. And in Eben Flood's instance, he's really reached the end of his life where he's looking down on a town that he's a stranger in now. He knows the facilities, the inns and the taverns and so forth, but he's not the same person that he had been. And there's a song in the 60s, I think it was, that those were the days. He could remember back on those being the days, and now he's not. The only people that he knows, and he's sitting as he's looking down on town in the cemetery, and you think about that as a sobering thing for those people who survive and looking back. And yet these veterans who have survived the war, whether that's previous to the Civil War or after the Civil War or the Civil War itself, will remember the men they went off to war with that never come back home. And they'll remember the sacrifices that these people have made, and their tent mates and their mess mates and all of the rest. And they don't want those folks to be forgotten. They don't want them to slip away. And so memorials, and sometimes Memorial Day or Decoration Day, was designed with that idea in mind, that we're going to remember the people who gave their last full measure, as Abraham Lincoln put it. So that's one reason why when people get into these phases of tearing monuments down, I'm totally against that, because the purpose of those monuments was to not celebrate the things that sometimes they're accused of celebrating. They're there to celebrate the lives and sacrifices and memories of the people that went to war, and some who came home and could help to put those memorials up, and some who the memorials are there because they couldn't come home. They didn't come home. So anybody that wants to tear down statues and memorials, I think, is failing to get the point that as these men got older, they wanted to not be forgotten. They wanted their beloved comrades not to be forgotten. And we certainly think of that when we see Saving Private Ryan and that opening scene and the closing where they were in the beautiful cemetery there in France. So when you look back at the Civil War, the war between the states, or the late unpleasantness, what did they want to do even during the war to have this occur? And one of the individuals that took a prominent role was the same one that had won the Battle of Mill Springs in January 1862. He had been the one who won a major battle before Ulysses Grant's name gets propped up. And yet he's not unconditional surrender Thomas, in part because the army that he defeats and disintegrates at Mill Springs manages to get away. He had pushed them all the way back into their fortified camp right on the rain-swollen Cumberland River, with the idea that as soon as he could get his forces together, he would call on them to surrender. And, of course, surrender is the only thing that seemed to make sense. Unfortunately for the Union side, and fortunately for the Confederates, they had a steamboat called the Noble Ellis that sort of did a mini Dunkirk. It took people from one side of the Cumberland River to the other, where they could then disperse and escape. And except for those who couldn't be moved, or the handful of stragglers, or folks who never seemed to be in the right place at the right time, most of the Confederates are going to get away. And when Thomas the next day comes in to try to finish them off, there's nothing to finish off. The army has escaped. And among others, that same officer who had his horse shot that then fired back at Felix Zollicoffer, Speed Fry, will say to him, "Why didn't you finish them off yesterday?" And Thomas has every rational reason why he didn't want to throw his forces in at the end of a day, after a long day of fighting and then pursuing. They were miles away from the battlefield now to the river, and by the time they got there, with the ammunition that's been expended, with the officers and others who've been lost from wounds or death, from disorganization, unit cohesion breaking down, it only made sense that you pull your troops together, and then the next morning, with overwhelming force against a trapped enemy, you finish them off, at least in terms of offering them surrender. Instead, they slipped away, and Speed Fry says, "Why didn't you finish them off?" And Thomas, I always admired his answer, "Hang it, Fry, I never once thought of it." It just didn't enter his mind that we should continue fighting even as darkness hit, even as all of these other reasons would mitigate your decision making for attacking. If it had been a more aggressive Grant type or Sherman type or Schofield type, then he might have continued pushing on and it would be a different story. But it was what it was. And Thomas certainly had enormous respect for his men. He trained and prepared his armies. He felt like that was a big reason for their success. But he also thought that his armies made him. He said, my men have made the general that I am. And so he had that kind of mindset, and he had a sense of taking care of his men. He also had a sense of remembering their sacrifice. There was a chaplain by the name of Van Horn that wrote a volume about the Army of the Cumberland. It celebrated, of course, the army itself, but celebrated its leader. And he has a part of a chapter concluding a piece that is entitled The Dead and Their Dispositions. And it refers to the creation of what becomes the first permanent national cemetery for soldiers established by military order at Chattanooga. And that's what General Thomas had pushed for. It was under his direction that this had occurred. And Van Horn was not only an author, he was a chaplain. And of course, he always, I think, felt the same compassion and passion for his men too. And he would understand this. And unfortunately, the exigencies of war, as they called it, prevented the execution of this work on the cemetery that they had planned for a good while. And he said for a while it was not possible to complete it the way that Thomas envisioned it, because Thomas really originally envisioned not only burying the men, but having histories, personal histories, if possible, for each one of the fallen. Well, that all is pretty impractical in a real situation. It doesn't certainly. It's a great feeling. It's a great sentiment. It's a great idea to pursue, but it would be impractical. Where are you going to put all of this history for anyone to read for this particular soldier, that particular soldier, and you want the same thing for all of those who are buried. And of course, as we know, so many of the fallen won't be able to be identified and become unknown. And how will you know their history? There's no way for you to know their history. So the whole idea of burying them so that you could then have memorials to them that are sort of mini memorials to each one was less practical and more unrealistic than I think Thomas understood at the time. So his notion was to do stuff to remember those who had fallen and their specific cases, their specific lives or their careers or their experiences. So kind of like a battle flag has battle honors. These would have been sort of mini honors of the kind of people and soldiers they had been. So if they had been at Shiloh, you would have Shiloh. If they'd been at Stones River, you'd have Stones River. If they'd been at Chickamauga, you'd have Chickamauga. Missionary Ridge, you'd have Missionary Ridge, and so forth, Kennesaw Mountain, and so forth. But Thomas's certainly heart was in the right place, and his mindset was the same as any of us who wish to remember the people who made their sacrifices and created this sort of memorialization of that as a way so that we would not forget and not risk that in the future others would forget what these people had done. I always say that the veterans themselves understood the sacred trust they were leaving to us. And that's, again, what makes it so difficult for me to see any distortion of memorials or statues or anything else, because so much of what's being done, whether it's in the cemeteries or ends up in a museum somehow, and city streets, courthouse yards, wherever those might be, those are ways of thinking about the men and the sacrifices they made. And even if you disagree with the decisions they made or the choices they made, you still have enough respect for history to understand that there was a reason that they made it, whether it was because they loved Virginia or there was because they were doing it for their homes or their wives and families, for whatever reason they might be doing. And of course, we know some people go off to war for less than glorious reasons. Maybe they're trying to get away or escape from something, or some other circumstance that's more negative. It doesn't matter if they shouldered a weapon and went off to war and then perished either from disease or from shot and shell or from some other reason, even accident. One of the generals that was a real negative kind of figure in a lot of ways was a guy named Michael Corcoran. Michael Corcoran had a hot temper at Suffolk, Virginia. He will be riding into a camp at a time when he should have realized that security was up. James Longstreet was in the vicinity in his 1863 campaign, and Michael Corcoran was well aware of that. Yet he rides up, a sentry calls out for him to stop and give the sign, and of course the countersign. The sign is given by the sentry, the countersign by the party that you're challenging. And he got angry and said he wasn't going to give a countersign, that he didn't have to, that because of who he was, the soldiers should let him pass. And unfortunately, Lieutenant Colonel by the name of Kimball is celebrating with some friends nearby, sees this occur, and comes to back up the sentry. Now, again, he'd been celebrating with his friends. Maybe some of that was involved. There's no question that sometimes difficult situations have other stimulants that occur to make them bad. But in this case, he comes to back up the sentry, and he says that he has to give the countersign as he was told to do, and Corcoran fires his weapon at him and strikes him and kills him. They're both on the same side. They were both soldiers with reputations and with men who loved and supported them, and yet one of them is struck down by quote-unquote friendly fire by his own man of his own side. And the general who sort of stops it from getting worse is a general by the name of George Washington Getty. I hope to have a book one day about him. I think he's another one of those unsung heroes who always seems to do some of the best work regardless of where he is. And he is smart enough to kind of diffuse the situation. He gets the troops that are part of Kimball's command, and he puts them at a location where they will be busied digging and improving earthworks and basically under Confederate fire. And someone said they won't have time enough to think about trouble. And so that was more or less the case. He got things simmered down, but there was, almost led to a mutiny in the face of the Confederate troops who were just right there under James Longstreet, under old Peter, the old war horse at Suffolk. So kind of a crazy time, and yet, again, it didn't matter whether Kimball fell from enemy fire or from his own side. He was not there, and his seat will be vacant. His seat will be empty, and yet his memory should be remembered. It should be taken care of, and that's part of what the veterans did with us. Is they passed this trust to us and left it up to us to try to find out the best ways to take that trust into our hearts. Of course, they went on to their eternal campgrounds with their comrades. Some people, of course, never reconciled. Some people did reconcile in life. That's also part of the human story. Not everybody's going to react the same way. There were periods of time where the country itself wanted to emphasize reconciliation, and so it made that sort of a universal norm that is never universal and never a norm, because there are plenty of exceptions for those people who, for different reasons, found it difficult to let the war go or put the war aside. There's been a lot of rehabilitation of the larger figures. Some of them, like Ulysses Grant, has gotten a lot of writing in recent years that try to put him in a much more positive light, that he's not the butcher and he's not the cigar-smoking, drinking officer who does squander the lives of his men, or the mistakes that he made in his presidency, largely often carried out by his subordinates. People in your cabinet or people that are in your administration are going to reflect on you. And times, of course, have sort of rehabilitated Grant and made him seem like he's got much more noble aspects than he had been presented with before. Sherman's another one of those people. If you had asked at different times and used the word Sherman in Georgia, some parts of Georgia, and maybe in the Carolinas, Columbia, South Carolina, for instance, you might have heard some negative or pejorative terms. One of the jokes about Sherman was that he was engaged in early urban renewal. But he oftentimes did what he did, again, for a reason, that he was trying to make war so horrific that those who were engaged in it would be more willing to come to terms to end the war than to continue it. And people like Robert E. Lee, who are given high and noble ways of looking at him, have since been sort of revised in a negative way. Again, he's a Confederate, and almost in some circles anything Confederate is as equivalent to the most evil things that you can think of. Well, Robert E. Lee at Appomattox will make the decision not to break up his army and to go into guerrilla warfare against the Union. He will accept the verdict of war, and he will tell his men to they've done all that could be done and to stack their arms. And Appomattox becomes a symbol of a reunited nation, even though there's still other surrenders to come, and the war will last for a little longer. So history loves to take individuals and you sort of give them these viewpoints at different times and then rehabilitate or revise in a negative way those images later on. But in sort of a strange and ironic way, regardless of how you look at these folks, what you're doing is remembering them. So whether it's through Decoration Day, Memorial Day, or the way that we look at these figures and revise our thinking about them, we are at least in some ways honoring the trust to never forget what these folks did and their exploits and their experiences in warfare. So thanks again for being with us. That's another edition of Civil War Reflections with Brian Wills. Stick with us next time and we'll delve into something new and something different.